Welcome to Policy Matters, Season 4, Episode 2. Policy Matters is a video chat series between Teri Talan of the McCormick Center and guest thought leaders in early childhood policy. This year, our focus is on racial equity, an important topic in early childhood education. It is being discussed at policy tables, promoted by philanthropy, and, in some exemplary programs, put into practice by leaders and teachers. What is racial equity? How does it differ from multicultural and inclusive early childhood services? Why is it important to call out racial equity in policy? How can you take action at the state, community, and program level? Our guest for this episode is Dr. Cynthia Tate, Executive Director of the Illinois Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development.
Cynthia, it is such a pleasure to have you join with me today for this policy chat on this really important topic, racial equity. And I want to just introduce you, Dr. Cynthia Tate from the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development in the state of Illinois. Could you start by just explaining a little bit about what the Governor's Office does so that people from outside of Illinois understand your role?
Sure. My pleasure. First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to talk about this work. It is important work. So the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development was established by executive order in 2009. And it was established to support the work of the Early Learning Council, which, for folks who don't know, in Illinois we have a public-private partnership called the Illinois Early Learning Council that considers and discusses and recommends policy for early childhood across the state from multiple funding sources. So it is not the administrator, but it is the governance body and the expertise in early childhood across systems resides there to a great extent. It is public-private, so it does have membership from the state agencies as well as universities and private providers, funders, advocacy organizations, and in that way it maintains a balance in the public-private partnership. Our role is to support that work, and our role is also, more broadly speaking, to support the cross-systems work in early childhood. Illinois, like most states, has its early childhood system funded through multiple departments because of the way that the federal funding flows into a state, right? And so our early childhood programs operate out of our State Board of Education, and that's our pre-K and also our prevention initiative, 0 to 3 as well as 3 to 5. And our child care operates out of the Department of Human Services. Our licensing for child care operates out of the Department of Children and Family Services, and maternal and child health is in the Department of Public Health.
Wow.
And so the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development, by sitting in the Governor's Office, can have that viewpoint that goes across systems. And so it's been supported largely over the years by federal grants that were early childhood systems building grants, including Race to the Top and the previous preschool development expansion grant. We had an expansion. And also home visiting. We had and still have a federal McV, that's a maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting grant. We've had that for about 8 years.
So how does the racial equity initiative that we're engaged in Illinois, how does that fit in the work of all of these different agencies, and what's the kind of plan for how to approach racial equity in terms of all the diverse projects and programs and services that you've just described?
It's challenging.
Yes.
Because we're talking, a complex system. But this is how it came about. So the BUILD initiative, which you may have discussed previously.
With Aisha, yes.
The BUILD initiative, we have a BUILD state team, which again is a public-private partnership across agencies and with multiple partners. And the BUILD state team engaged with the BUILD consultants. Dr. Aisha Ray is our build consultant for racial equity to work with the Early Learning Council on this racial equity work. And so what we did to get this work going was first of all, we started by just having times on the meeting calendar for the executive committee to talk about what is racial equity, how are other states approaching racial equity, do we want to do something, just really getting everybody sort of on board with the work. I won't say it's on the same page because that took a couple more steps, but on board with that this is something that we feel is important to do as the Early Learning Council, and this is something we want to embark on, and that we realize that racial equity and moving toward racial equity will involve everyone. It will take everyone to move in that direction and to achieve the goals that we would like to see achieved. So we had a retreat last summer, and it was an Early Learning Council executive retreat. Also, the members of the build team were there and worked with Dr. Ray to orchestrate the retreat. And we did the planning and figured out what we would get done during that retreat. And at that retreat, we began with coming together on a definition of racial equity. Would you like to know what that is?
I would, because in the conversation with Aisha Ray, we talked, about how people don't all come with the same understanding about what racial equity means, and it can trigger positive or negative, and it could be wrong, but certainly wasn't consistent across a large body of people. So yes, share with us.
So after much discussion and many versions, we agreed on this on July the 18th. A racially equitable society values and embraces all racial ethnic identities. In such a society, one's racial ethnic identity, particularly Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Asian, is not a factor in an individual's ability to prosper. And so that's one sentence. But it did take us some time to get there because there are a lot of questions that are answered there. For example, we had a lot of discussion about what's the role of culture in relation to race and ethnicity, and is this what we're talking about? Or, we have lots of ethnic groups who may not fit into any one of these particular categories.
Right.
Are we talking about addressing every single ethnicity within a racial group? So we had a lot of conversation, and this is what we arrived at. And so related to that definition, we established three components, parts, okay? So what we said about the early learning system in particular about racial equity is that early learning system that is racially equitable is driven by data. And that speaks very clearly, and we wanted to be very upfront about the fact that we intend for the work in racial equity to be data driven, that we want to actually look at the data that demonstrates both where we are and where we're going to measure our progress toward achieving racial equity. So we have these three, and I don't want to do a whole lot of reading, but I do want to just kind of summarize what these three subcomponents are. One of them is having to do with the children and the families being able to develop optimally. So this is where we begin to make a societal definition. We gave kind of a societal level definition at first of what we see as being racial equity. Then we begin to move into what does it have to do with young children and their families. So the first thing that it has to do with is making sure that they have everything that they need to develop optimally. That's the business that we're in, is making sure that young children develop optimally and that their families can support them in that. The second component of that has to do with the distribution of resources and opportunities and rewards and burdens, and that those things would not be tied to one's race. And otherwise, one's race and ethnicity should not be the identifier for whether or not you have sufficient resources in your community to achieve what you want to achieve. We should not be able to look at the data and say, here is a community that is predominantly Latino, and here is a community that is predominantly white, and the resources are starkly different. So, which is actually the case, across Illinois, in many instances. And so what we're saying is that resources and opportunities need to be equitably distributed. And then the last thing is we're looking at policies and systems, and we're saying that we want to reframe policies and we want to design systems so that we have greater equity and justice for our children and our families.
So how do you see implementing this? Because I think it's great to have the definition and to have teased out those three component areas. But then how do you actually move it forward in terms of addressing policies in the state of Illinois?
Yes. So that is the question, right? So the Early Learning Council has a committee structure. And it has 5 standing committees and multiple subcommittees. And those committees are working continually, as you know, as the co-chair of the Quality Committee, nice. On critical areas of early childhood systems building. So quality and access, the integration and alignment of our systems. And that particular committee has a number of different subcommittees, including community systems and health and data, research and evaluation, and I'm doing all this on the top of my head. I'm sure I missed a subcommittee. But then also we have the home visiting task force. So these are the standing committees, and we're going to be working through that committee structure. So what the build team did is that we developed a template to go out to each of the committees so that each committee can develop a work plan that shows how that committee's work will move forward toward the achievement of our goals. And so we set forward 3 large goals that correspond to those 3 component parts of our definition that I just went over. And then supporting those 3 goals are 7 strategies. I won't read those,
okay.
But there are 7 strategies. And so what we're saying is, in order to achieve these goals around racial equity for young children and their families, we're going to employ these strategies. Now, Access Committee, when you do your work to ensure equitable access, how are you going to ensure that we're talking about equitable access as it relates to race and ethnicity? So we'll come to the Quality Committee and we'll give you your template.
Right.
And we will say, Quality Committee, here are the goals, here are 7 strategies. How are you going to take the work that you're doing to ensure the highest quality of early care and learning experience for children and their families is supported toward the goal of achieving racial equity in our quality work? And then we'll go to the others and do the same thing. And so ultimately, what we're going to have is multiple work plans. And let me say one thing, that area that's really important to us. Within our Access Committee is a Family Engagement Committee. And it's really also critical that we keep the family voice present and active and heard in our work, as you know, because this is a value that we all share in the early learning community. And so we will be asking families, how do we make this work? Touch you and your community in a more racially equitable way. And so we will have work plans across all these committees and subcommittees. And then at some point, we do have a timeline, but at some point in the spring, we will bring these work plans together, and then we'll have a large overall work plan around racial equity for the Early Learning Council, and we will have then the second retreat next July to really make that integration happen, and that's what our goal is.
it's a pretty audacious goal, and I am a part of the process in multiple places in the system that you laid out. So one thing I just want people to know who are watching us is that this seems sort of like it's a lot of committees, it's kind of bureaucratic, it's about work plans and strategic plans, but it's very human work, and it touches so many people. There are so many. You mentioned families, there are practitioners, there's academics, there's policy wonks, there's researchers, there's philanthropists who are all engaged in this work through all these different committees. So I just have to say that it is enriching to really be a part of this work, because once you start looking with an equity lens, it's impossible not to see the inequities in our system. And so
Absolutely.
The more people we touch with this, and through your leadership leading this work, I think that we really have a really strong chance of turning that situation on its head.
Thank you. I think so too. And I think what you said about, once you start looking through a racial equity lens, you can't not see through that lens. And that shift, I think, is occurring within the Early Learning Council. And you can hear it now in all of our meetings. I don't think there's a single meeting that we have that the issue isn't, brought up, because we are now using that lens for everything we do. I know as we work on how does the early childhood block grant funding get distributed?
Right.
Now, that is a bureaucratic process, right? So, the distribution of funds by a state is, basically what a state is supposed to do. But how do you make that distribution of funds equitable and not just equal? Right. And those are different concepts. And I'm sure Dr. Ray talked about the difference between equity and equality. And so we can see that. We can see that when we work with our state agency partners, where a state is, in all good intention, trying to engage in a process of distribution of funds where everyone has an equal chance, right? So you do everyone has an equal chance, and you do open bidding, and anybody can apply. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so that's equality. Right. But that is not going to get you to equity, because when we do that, what happens is that the communities who have been historically under-resourced don't have the capacity and resources to write for a proposal that will qualify them. And so we have to do a couple of things about that. Number one, we have to put other kinds of data and statistics into what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. We have to specifically, to the extent that we can, within this kind of equality, background, try to figure out how to support those communities to be able to compete, and for us to be able to distribute the resources equitably. And so that's an example of how bringing that lens to what it really is very bureaucratic work is still really critical, because bottom line is, end of day, if you're not able to fund your preschool program because you didn't have a grant writer and this other community was, because they had a professional grant writer who, or they had a better data analytic, capacity, or, any number of these things, then it's the children who are not going to have, that advantage that preschool gives children.
I thank you for putting it into a concrete example, because that is really the question. How is council some of the work that we did was through this public-private partnership.
Yeah.
Make sure there were resources to help under-resourced communities with grant writing, and to think about these things ahead of time to try to achieve more equitable ends, both through the strategy and ultimately
Yes.
the end goal. So thank you. I really appreciate taking the
Thank
time to
you.
meet with me and to further explore the whole issue about racial equity. We'll be talking about this and working on this together for some time.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Teri.